Hey, you're looking for a podcast where you can hear from some great hockey legends, listen to them tell some amazing stories, find out what they're up to today? Well, this is it. It's the Domino's Pizza Overtime Podcast. I'm your host, Gino Retta. Today's guest, oh my gosh, a true legend of the game. He's a two-time Stanley Cup champion, voted one of the top 100 players of all time, a key member of Canada's team in the 1972 infamous Summit Series with Russia, one of the biggest international events the game of hockey's ever seen. Inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1997 was the undisputed heart and soul of the Broadstreet Bullies, Philadelphia Flyers legend, my pal Bobby Clarke. Bob, it is great to see you, and you look fantastic. How are you doing?
Hey, Gino.
How are you feeling? How's the health? How's it going?
Yeah, that's good. I'm doing great, thank you. I do nothing, but I'm good at it. I just like watching hockey, the same as ever, but I'm just not responsible anymore.
That's true. Well, for our audience, you were involved in the game for decades. You were involved as a general manager for decades. You've been involved as a consultant and with the Flyers organization for years and years and years. You're still sporting the Flyers colors for those who are watching the podcast. I want to ask you, though, for another jersey that you wore, the Team Canada jersey, because there's so much international hockey in the news right now with on the heels of the Four Nations Cup, looking ahead to the Olympic Games next year in Italy. Does it set a little fire inside you, remembering the incredible animosity and the incredible pride you had playing for Team Canada for all those years?
Oh, yeah. This most recent one, it was sensational. The hockey being played was sensational, and I think we as Canadians have been the target for every other country forever. They all want to beat us. And as long as our players are wearing the maple leaf, male or female, they're wearing the maple leaf, they're awful tough to beat.
You were involved in the 1972 Summit Series. For the younger hockey fans who may not know this, this was bigger than a hockey tournament. Can you set the stage? And you were just a kid. You were in your early 20s. What were you, 23 when you were playing for Canada in this? Give our audience an understanding of what it was like. What was the climate in Canada as we were facing the Russians in the Summit Series, and what did it mean to you to represent Canada?
It meant the same to me as it meant to every other Canadian hockey player who wears the Maple Leaf jersey. As I said, male or female, the pride in our country. 72 was, I don't know how to describe the feelings, but I know that one of the great scorers of all time, Phil Esposito, played the four greatest games of his life. Evan Cornway won 10 Stanley Cups. The greatest games, 4 games in Russia. Should have seen him. And Paul Henderson, who was a really good NHL player, but not a superstar, he played a way better in Russia than he ever played again in his career. I mean, putting on that jersey, the players rise to another level.
It was more than hockey, though, wasn't it, Bob?
It,
Because it was at that point it was a political thing, because there was the Cold War. There was the way Russia did it and the way we did it in Canada. And I think both of us were trying to prove that we were doing it the right way. How much of a shock, because we didn't know that much about the Russians going into that tournament, how much of a shock was it through the first couple of games where you realized, oh my gosh, these guys are better than we thought they were going to be?
it took it to maybe the first period. When we come in after the first period, we scored 2 goals real quick. It's going to be one of those games, right? Yeah. By the end of the first period, we knew we were in big trouble. They were obviously as good a hockey players as us. That stage, they were better conditioned, they were better prepared. So we had to regroup, and we couldn't regroup in Canada. We didn't have the time, but in Russia, we're down 3-1 with 3 games to go. you've seen the best of what we had to give. We're in our Maple Leaf.
And you were a part of like right the center of hockey history. You played in a line with Paul Henderson and Ron Ellis. When you guys went into the tournament, we were all talking about the Cornwalliers and the Espositos and like all the guys who had at that point already put together the Hall of Fame careers. And your Hall of Fame careers were just beginning at that point. And yet you took control because in game 6, 7, and 8, you guys were part of the winning goals in all three of those games to take the series. What was it like to be a part of that as just a young 23-year-old kid surrounded by all that greatness?
Well, I think it helps to be innocent. I was young, was the last player picked, so expectations were low, and I just played hockey. And as it turned out, I think, like the other players, my game got better through the series, and I rose to another level. And because I was young, I was able to carry it over into my NHL career. And it certainly affected my NHL career, what I learned from watching these guys like Cornway and Savard, guys, Esposito, guys who had won at the NHL.
It was pretty amazing because after that, you came back to the NHL and you ended up winning three of the next four Hart trophies. It was a different Bob Clarke that came back from the Canada-Russia Summit Series. There's no doubt about that. And then you got a chance to play in the 1976. I'm going to get to your Stanley Cup in a minute, but I want to talk to you about the 1976 Canada Cup, which then brought together the best of the best. Bobby Orr didn't get to play in the 72 Summit Series. Bobby Hull couldn't play in that. Now you've got what people call probably the greatest gathering of Canadian hockey talent in history at the 76 Canada Cup. And you were the captain of that team. What was it like to be a part of that?
As you said, that there's many that consider that the best team that Canada's put on the ice for these tournaments, but I could make a legitimate argument that having Mario Lemieux and Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier and Paul Coffey and those guys, that's a pretty good team. So,
Yeah.
but we were a good team, um, and again, I think elevated the play of some of the younger players. Come on, Gerald Settler became a star in that series and carried it through the rest of his career. Bobby Orr, best player in the tournament, playing on one leg. Denny Potvin, these guys rose to such heights and carried them through their whole NHL careers. Those series helped individual players because they figured out to win those series, you had to play by far the best hockey of your careers. And these guys did it, and it carried over into their NHL play. It was good for Canada, but it was good for the NHL too.
There's something that gets the blood going, eh, Bobby? We just saw it at the Four Nations with the three fights between Canada and the USA in the first 9 seconds. But that wasn't something that they invented. There was a certain event, and I want you to get your comment on this. Back in the 72 Summit Series, Valery Harlamov was one of the best players on the Russian team. And he was a guy we need to stop. And you were our stopper for Canada. And there was an incident where there was a slash that ended up knocking Harlamov on the leg, that ended up knocking him out with a broken leg. What's your take on that incident and how we got to that point and what happened afterwards?
Well, it was something I did that I'm not proud of, but during the course of that series, it was a pretty dirty series. They also were dirty players when they had to be, and so were we. And that particular incident, he stuck me a little bit going up one way down the ice, and I hunted him down and whacked him. I wasn't thinking that I'm going to break his ankle, but I guess it hurt. Maybe it broke it, but he didn't play much after that. So as Esposito said, why didn't you do that in the first game? You know, but that's those kind of things. Those kind of things. They're nothing to be proud of, but I did it. Gotta live with it.
There are a lot of times when we kind of look back on those things and think, man, that was something. I remember in January 1976, the Soviet Red Army had an exhibition series they were playing, and they ended up playing in Philly. And it got like it was supposed to be just a fun exhibition series, literally in the middle of the NHL season. But anytime Canada steps on the ice against, at that point, Russia, today it's the USA, things get heated. What are your memories of that January 1976 playing the Soviet Red Army?
We were Stanley Cup champs, and the Soviets hadn't been beaten yet, and their last game was the Flyers. And Shiro, our coach, had spent a lot of time in Russia, so he knew. And by that time, we knew how the Russians played the game, and it helped. But he had us so prepared. It was a really easy game to play. They didn't really want to play. Eddie Van Imp called Karlamov, and he didn't get up, and they went off the ice. And as soon as they were told that they weren't going to get no money, they come back and played. But it was not a hard game for any of us on the Flyers. They didn't really show up. They just wanted to go home.
That was funny because for those of you, you should Google it on YouTube. The call is spectacular. As the Russians are leaving the ice, I don't know if you ever got back and looked at it, Bobby. They're going home. Things got a little rusty. Things got a little nasty, and they're going home. The Russians are taking their sticks and they're going home. That was one of the all-time great moments. Talk to me about, but that was the time of Tretiak and Yakushev, and like it was us against them. They were the enemy. But since then, you guys have become friends. Is that true? Tell me about that, Bob.
Yeah, Tretiak had come over, and I had him at my house, and we had a tournament in Ottawa, played some exhibition games later, and went out with Yakushev and Vasiliev and some of those guys. What you find out is they were no different than us. They were just hockey players. Like to have a beer, like to have a drink, like to practice. You know, this the same as where politics was for others. We were mostly what you would call, I guess, ordinary people who played hockey and wanted to win. Competed. We're Canadians, so we competed like hell representing our country, and they did the same for Russia. They were no different than we were. They're good guys, good hockey players too.
Get ready for the game with the Domino's $8.99 mix and match deal. Score big with any medium two-topping pizza and any two items like pastas, stuffed cheesy bread, boneless chicken, or classic chicken wings. Domino's has you covered. Order today from Canada's favorite pizza at domino's.ca. Bobby, walk me through the changes on the team. You know, you're a young kid there. You're in your early 20s. The Philadelphia Flyers at that point were not a strong team and were not feared by other people. But then there was the change. Talk to me about the change of the Flyers at that point.
Well, the Flyers hired Freddie Shiro. We'd been beaten up physically, not me. I wasn't on the team yet, by St. Louis in the playoffs, and Snyder committed to making our team tougher. He said, you know, we might not win the hockey games. We're not going to get physically beat up. And the year I was drafted, they drafted Schultz and Selesky and players. And Shearer came in to coach, and we got Bernie Perron had been traded to Toronto. We got him back. That was a couple of years later, and traded for McClish. And Keith Allen made some really good deals. It made us a really good. We had really good players, but you have to be a good team. And Freddie Shearer brought in a style that worked for all of us. And when Schultz and we got Andre Dupont and Bob Kelly and some guys who could fight, and we probably took fighting to the excess. But I'm quite sure in that time there's only 12 teams. I'm quite sure that, you know, when we went into Oakland, we sold out. Everybody else was drawing 5,000 people. So the league didn't like what we were doing, but they liked us filling the buildings. And we became a real good team, obviously, and won 2 cups.
Yeah,
Not because of fighting.
no,
They had
yeah,
talent.
but you were just a kid. You were 23 years old, and then all of a sudden they hand you the C, and at that point you became the youngest captain at that point in NHL history. What was that like when they came to you and said, "Bob, here's the new group we put together. Here's our new direction of the way we want to go, and by the way, you're going to be our captain." What was that like to hear that?
It wasn't quite done that way in those days. Freddie Shero had talked to me about being the captain, and I said, Eddie Van Impe's the captain. I don't want to be. But about 3 months later, probably the next year, anyways, Freddie said, "You're our captain." And I said, "No, you got a captain." He said, "No, I'm telling you, you're going to be our captain." And I said, "Well, if you let me go talk to Eddie and see if it's all right." So I went and talked to Eddie Van Impe, and I told him what Freddie had said, and he said, "Good, you should be the captain." So it made it easy to become captain of that team.
And you had a breakout season. Again, you were just a kid. You had 104 points. You became the first player from a non-original six team to reach the 100-point mark. Was it at that point where the message was sent? There's the original six, and then there's us and then you guys here, and we're ready for a change in the guard, because you ended up in that season winning your first of 3 Hart trophies.
Yeah, maybe it was a sympathy vote because I was from the expansion side. I don't know, but I did have a good year. Um, it was there was a bit of an arrogance, obviously, from the original six. They thought they were better than us. Once the Flyers started winning some games, I think it helped the other expansion teams too. St. Louis was a good franchise in those days too, still is. But I think it was good that we became equal as 12 teams. It was good for hockey.
So in 1974, after being buddies with Phil Esposito in the Canada-Russia series and getting to know Bobby Orr quite well, you're facing them in the Cup final. What was that like to face them? Because I remember you just completely shutting down 2 of the greatest players in NHL history. What are your memories of that?
Well, we were underrated. They didn't realize or take us serious enough. They didn't realize how good a team we were. We just beat the Rangers, and the Rangers thought they were going to win the Stanley Cup. They thought they were better than the Bruins. So um, they beat us twice, both times because Orr. You can't really contain a player like Orr. You just hold him down a little bit. And Shero did what, or told us to do what had never been done, I'm sure, to a player like Orr. He just kept saying, "Throw the puck in Orr's corner and get there as fast as you can and run into him. Don't try and hit him necessarily. Just run into him, tire him." And we continued to do that the whole series. And I think eventually Bobby got somewhat tired, and we were good enough. Like, they didn't know how good Bill Barber was. They didn't know how good Rick McLeish was, and estimated us. Once we got on a roll, I think they figured it out, but it was too late.
What was that like when the clock ticked down to 0 and you realized you're Stanley Cup champion? You just knocked off a team full of Hall of Famers, a team that was favored over you. You'd gotten by the New York Rangers. What was that like when it was finally done and you won the first Stanley Cup in franchise history?
I don't know how anybody could ever put into words to describe that type of feeling. And I'm good friends with Serge Savard, and we've had this discussion numerous times. That he felt 72 was the biggest moment of his career. And of course, my argument is, of course, you won 10 Stanley Cups.
Yeah.
Someone like me who had 1 or 2, I said winning the Stanley Cup might be bigger than 72 for me. But it's both were pretty special, to tell you the truth.
Bob, when I think of the stuff that you overcame to get there, first and foremost, let's start with your where you came from. You came from Flin Flon, Manitoba. Population at that point, I think it was maybe around 3,000 people. And you're suddenly thrust into a city of Philadelphia.
No,
Where
no,
sorry, go ahead. You were thrust into
no. I was going to
Philadelphia
say that Flin Flon is 15,000.
now.
Yeah, but Flin Flon is a modern mining town. We had everything up there, but uh, sports was huge, and we had piles of kids because at the end of the Second World War, the mine needed men and women to come up there and work. So we had all kinds of kids to compete against, and the number of players that came out of Flin Flon that played in the NHL is huge. And I know going to Philly was, I hadn't been in any cities really other than Winnipeg playing junior, but it was a change for sure.
And you also had a health issue
But
because you had
I
diabetes
was
at a time
I
where,
wanted I only wanted to play hockey.
yeah, you were also struggling.
All I wanted to do was go to, pardon?
You were also struggling with diabetes at that point where today we know how to handle it. You can carry, the proper medication, insulins with you all the time, and there's little packs you can have on your body that tests you constantly. But you didn't have that back when you were a kid coming up through the thing. Was there a time where you thought my diabetes may prevent me from realizing my dream? And how did you overcome that?
Well, I think being dumb helps a little bit to overcome those kind of things. I I always felt that I was a hockey player who had diabetes, and I knew what I had to do. I had to take insulin. I had to watch what I ate and drank and all that stuff. But it never affected the way I played hockey. I never even thought about it really. And I know it's a lot easier for diabetics now, and it's a lot easier for me to look after my diabetes. But in those days, it was what it was. I just wanted to play hockey, and diabetes wasn't going to be an excuse for me not to play hockey.
Now, I heard a story you got a real scare during training camp in Quebec City where you had a seizure in a taxi cab. Is that right? What do you remember about that?
Yeah, oh yeah, I know exactly what happened. We practiced, I don't know, say 9 o'clock, and I got in. I slept in a little bit, and so instead of having take my insulin, instead of having breakfast, I quick jumped in a car and went to practice. When practice was over, my blood sugar had gone down pretty low, and they were driving me back. I was just getting a ride back, and I passed out. So they took me to the hospital, and the doctors and the nurses, they knew immediately what it was, and uh, brought me back. So I was fine. They got the sugar back in, and I got a real nice lecture from a French Canadian woman who was the nurse there at the time about not looking after myself. She is pretty firm on it. And from that time forward, I never forgot not only what she said to me about making sure you eat and all that, but about taking better, you just can't do that if you're a diabetic, decide you're not going to eat. So it was when you don't know, it was a little bit scary, but it wasn't fateful,
Yeah.
or I mean, what do you call it? Whatever the word is, didn't kill me.
You overcame the odds, though, man. I mean, the fact that, with as a kid, the 72 Summit Series, the playing for Canada, the Canada Cup, a couple of Stanley Cups for the Flyers when nobody would have ever expected that could accomplish. And it really changed the face of the game, Bobby, because you mentioned it yourself. The NHL maybe didn't want to publicly say we like what the Flyers are doing, but all of a sudden the popularity of the league started skyrocketing especially in the United States. It was always popular in Canada, but it started skyrocketing. What was it like when you were greeted in city after city being known as the Broadstreet Bullies that were changing the face of the NHL at that point and the sudden rise in popularity of the league? What was it like to be a part of that?
I don't think any of us ever thought of it that deeply. We liked being the villain. It gives you something to rally around, and as I've always said it, we all feel the same way if you're in hockey. I hope we're good enough so someone hates us. Who wants to play on a team that everybody else wants to play against? So it was for that group of players that we were together for quite a while. It was really a great time.
Sure, you won 2 Stanley Cups. And the Flyers, ultimately, the Flyers became who Bob Clarke was. And when you were starting to think about retirement, there was a natural transition. It started with Pat Quinn, who was your coach at that point, asked you to be an assistant coach with him for a little while. And then Ed Snyder worked you into a job as a general manager where you were there for almost 20 years as a Philadelphia Flyers general manager. What was that transition like for you, retiring from the game of playing the game to being involved in coaching and then ultimately as a general manager for so long?
Well, I think Mr. Snyder, or it was his son Jay who hired me. It was probably a mistake. I had absolutely no management training or skills or anything. All of a sudden, I'm sitting behind a desk. I'd never negotiated a contract. I'd never scouted. I'd never done anything. And they had already interviewed Mike Keenan. So I talked with Mike Keenan, read his resume and stuff, and talked and hired him. And he was the reason for we had good players, but he was the reason we got to the Stanley Cup Finals, run into Edmonton a couple of times through my early management learning process. But to come off the ice and sit behind a desk with a grade 10 education, you just can't do that. But I got away lucky, I think.
We were lucky to be able to watch you play, Bobby.
Thanks to.
And I've been so lucky to get to know you and call you over the years. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Before I let you go, I want to play something we call 5 Fast Facts, where I ask you 5 quick questions and you give me the first thing that comes to your mind. You up for it?
Sure.
All right, time now for 5 Fast Facts with 2-time Stanley Cup champion, Philadelphia Flyers legend, Bob Clarke. Bob, who was the best teammate that you ever played with?
Bill Barber.
Who was the best coach you ever played for?
Red Sherrill.
Who did you hate playing against the most and why?
Rangers. I don't know why, but always hated the Rangers.
After all the success in your career, both on the ice and off the ice, if you could go back and give yourself a piece of advice back when you were 15 years old, what would you have said to a 15-year-old Bob Clarke?
I think probably just work. You're raised, if you're going to play hockey, work. It's not a fun game when you're playing against somebody who's trying to beat the shit out of you. Work.
If you hadn't become a pro hockey player, what career do you think you would have done instead?
I would have stayed working in the mine. When I quit school in the 10th grade, my dad was so disgusted with me that, you better be a darn good hockey player because I've saved money to send you to school. And if you're not playing hockey, you'll be back working in the mine. And that's a laborer's job and hard work. So I'm quite sure I would have went back to the mine.
Well,
I didn't go to school, so where was I?
On behalf of all the hockey fans who got to watch you play, my friend, you made the right decision. Thank you. 5 Fast Facts with three-time MVP and Hockey Hall of Famer, Bobby Clarke. Bob, thank you so much for this, buddy. I'm so glad you look so good. You look and sound so good. It has been so much fun reconnecting with you, buddy. Thank you for doing this with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Joe. Take care.
Take care. Voted one of the top 100 players of all time, 3-time MVP, 2-time Stanley Cup champion, Bob Clarke. The Overtime Podcast is proudly presented by Domino's Pizza and Athlete's Care. If you're watching the big game at home or hungry right now, Domino's has you covered. Check out the Domino's Mix and Match deal. Medium, 2-topping pizzas, pastas, stuffed cheesy bread, boneless chicken or classic chicken wings. Any 2 items for only $8.99 each. Canada's favorite pizza at Domino's.ca. Athletes Care is proud to be celebrating their 26th year, offering sports medicine services to both elite athletes and the general population who require rehab for a new or chronic injury or pain. Go to where the best go, Athletes Care Sports Medicine Clinics, with 26 locations in the Greater Toronto Area and Ottawa. Hey, if you missed any parts of the show, don't worry. Visit our website at overtimepodcast.ca. The Domino's Pizza Overtime Podcast can be found on Spotify, iTunes Podcasts, or any of your favorite podcast platforms as well. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel at O-Time Podcast. Until next week, I'm Gino Retta saying so long, hockey fans, and thanks for joining us on the Domino's Overtime Podcast.